panel, to the extent to which you are altruistic, you will be a good cult leader. To the extent that you're not, it's really fucking fun. Either way, being a corporate slave is probably worse, and we hate the capitalist system. Being a cult leader is better for you, and it's better probably for society, which I think Matt will explain a little bit more. Okay, so 3 broad points in this speech. Firstly, just going through a bit of setup about what your interests are likely to be as a person who's wearing this watch. Secondly, why being a cult leader is best to meet these interests. And thirdly, why working at Goldman Sachs is probably worse for these interests comparably to being a cult leader. Okay, so firstly, what are your interests given that you are wearing this watch? The main gist of this is you've become a shitty self-obsessed person. Okay, so 4 reasons why this is likely to be true. Firstly, we think that if you're constantly making decisions based on future outcomes only for yourself, because you are constantly being reaffirmed by the fact that your watch is telling you this, you are trained to probably only care about yourself and only care about the future outcomes for yourself, such to the point that what is being constantly reminded to you is the outcomes for yourself, not the outcomes that would be for other people in this case, because you cannot see them through the watch. Secondly, we think that there is a selection bias here about who would consent to use this watch, and we would note that as a 12-year-old, you are probably old enough to make that kind of decision to wear a watch or not yourself. So given the fact that you know that this watch will just give you outcomes for you, we think that if you choose to wear a watch that only gives you outcomes for yourself, such to the point that you can choose those outcomes best for you, we think that you probably already are relatively concerned about yourself relative to other people, and you're relatively concerned about outcomes specifically for you. Thirdly, we think that there's no pleasure in the moment under this case, because you're disproportionately concerned with careerism. So if you're constantly concerned about the future outcomes of wearing this watch, we think you are particularly going to be concerned about just the direct outcomes for you in terms of your career. And fourthly, we think that the watch is gonna fuck with you, right? So you're gonna have no concept of what you want, because you're constantly being overwhelmed by all of these decisions. When a crisis happens like this, where you're asked to make this giant decision, you're probably just defaulting to self-interest anyway, because you're asked to make these decisions constantly. And we don't think that necessarily wearing this watch will make you any better at making those decisions. Therefore, for all of those reasons, we think you're likely to be selfish, we think you're likely to be self-interested, and we think that's going to be reaffirmed by wearing this watch. Therefore, the rest of this case will basically talk about why, given that you are self-interested, going to become a cult leader is going to be better for you. Richard, did you have a point?
No, you must.
Oh, thanks. I'll come back to you. Okay, so why being a cult leader is better for your interests. So, sort of 3 main reasons why this is likely to be true. So firstly, to the extent that you might be altruistic, you can probably be a good person as the cult leader. Secondly, we think the cult is likely to exist anyway. There will always be some people somewhere who are disproportionately self-obsessed and need the confirmation of people all the time that they are important. And secondly, we think that there will always be people without direction who are going to join these cults in the first instance. So thirdly, we think that being a cult leader is best, seeing that you are disproportionately self-interested to just get whatever the fuck you want, which is really what we want in this case. Firstly, under this, your own importance is just going to be constantly reaffirmed, such to the point that you are considered a literal god, or at least very, comparable to one in the sense that you can communicate with God, or that you are somehow on a different level to other people. We think that given that you are someone who is self-interested, it's going to be very beneficial for you. Secondly, we think that given that there are less resource restrictions on you, there's probably going to be a pretty significant pool of resources that you can pretty much constantly use to get your own interests in any way. Secondly, we think that as an accepted divine leader who is God, you probably don't need popular support for any decision that you're going to make as a cult leader, such to the point that they are already considering you essentially to be a divine power who cannot be questioned. And thirdly, we think that you're insulated from any criticism of any kind that disrupts your self-important nature, because again they are directly incentivized to not critique you, seeing they think that you are literal God. Therefore, we think for all of those reasons, being a cult leader is much better for your interests in the sense that you have many more resources to do whatever you want. We think you are a person as this actor who is mainly concerned about getting whatever you want, and for all of those reasons, we think that being a cult leader is probably better. But furthermore, why is being a Goldman Sachs analyst particularly worse by comparison? Can I take you?
No, sorry.
Okay. So why is being a Goldman Sachs analyst particularly bad, given you have these incentives to be particularly self-interested? So 4 main reasons why this is likely to be true. Firstly, being a middle manager really sucks, right? So this is again, if your interests are particularly selfish, One, you get no individual recognition. In this position, you are not like likely to be somebody who is like of any kind of particular importance. You're probably not somebody who is like going to be shown on newsletters or the website, stuff like that, because there are going to be dozens of other people like you. We think of somebody who's like completely self-interested, probably a careerist. This is going to be like a pretty big disadvantage for you. Secondly, we think it's like probably really fucking boring. I don't know about you, I'm not a finance major, but like if you were going to like choose a job between these, I think that like the fact that you are constantly going to be going to work, pretty much like repeating the same sort of work again and again, as is pretty characteristic of middle managers, seeing that you are like one of many people within the organization, we think that like it is pretty likely that that will be like of importance to you. So, secondly, we think that everybody hates you because you're a banker and do shitty things. Like, the Royal Commission exists for a reason, in the sense that, like, bankers have a broadly very bad reputation in society for being very exploitative, for being, like, rich little shits who went to private schools. And we think that, like, all of these things are likely to be true. And we think that such the point that you need hero worship from everybody constantly, people thinking that you're really shitty is probably not going to be a good thing for you. Yes?
Sorry, yes. So, what do you think people's general perception of cult leaders are?
The thing is, right, you're isolated within the cult, as being part of the cult basically was. I think that, like, what is less important to you isn't, like, the broad perception of society, is the fact that you have, like, a small group who is pretty much, like, sycophantically obsessed with you. I think that, honestly, that probably balances out. Especially seeing that, like, being part of the cult insulates you from any sort of criticism from the outside. You're probably in a secluded place. That's probably what cults are likely to look like. So, yeah. So, thirdly, we think that you have little autonomy, but very much of an expectation of autonomy as a banker. We think that, like, you probably don't have autonomy because you're just taking decisions from middle management, but you will probably be blamed for decisions, seeing that you probably have people who are managing you yourself. And we think that that is directly opposite in a cult, such to the point that you have, like, essentially infinite power in terms of resources, in terms of support, in terms of people just, like, reaffirming how great you are all the time. And also, we think that you have no accountability, such to the point that God is telling you to do all these things. You can pretty much do whatever you want and make those decisions based on any kind of, like, arbitrary mechanism. And, like, because you have that sort of backup for it, we think that's quite fine. And then lastly, we think that you have, like, pretty much no personal life. We think you have fewer close relationships, and if they are, you're strained. If you're a cult leader, you have infinite wives and friends. And I think that is why I'm very, very proud to govern.
Swaak to the next one, and then just like, or we can just go on to my timer after.
No, we got it. Great.
The big problem with what Goldman has essentially given you is like this characterization of this 12-year-old as narcissistic, borderline like sociopathic, in order to be so self-interested and narcissistic that you would opt to be a cult leader. And then there's also like a slight contention within their case and within their characterization itself is like that like this 12-year-old kid would want like infinite wives and like infinite friends, and also like simultaneously like this irrational like opting like gut reaction like yes, this seems better, but this 12-year-old would also at the same time understand what it's like to be hated as a mid-level finance analyst. It just seems like you can't both have a understanding 12-year-old who would understand these impacts, but also be so irrational as to be like, yeah, more wives and more friends, and like, you know, I can just do whatever I want. This seems like a problem within their characterization. So I'm going to give you this counter-characterization of like, what is just more reasonable of what a 12-year-old would actually think. So 12-year-olds, when you're 12, you're in year 6 or you're in year 7, and the debating topics that we give to year 7s is like stuff like, should kids from year 7 to 8 learn self-defense? And this, like, I adjudicated this, right? And the things I got in terms of content and what year 12-year-olds were giving me, there were things like, yeah, like, you know, we should protect women from like sexual harassment because I've been like sexually harassed. This was a year 7 chick, and I was like, wow. To the extent of which like 12-year-olds can understand that like, you know, there's consequences, there's like an idea of morality, that your actions have consequences on society and around you, you probably have some logic. You probably have your own ideas of like what interests you, like what subjects you like at school. And we think that you're probably like pretty aware or pretty included in terms of like pop culture. And so you probably have like, yeah, you probably generally know what like being a cult, like, or like you have a general perception of whatever the media gives you and feeds you on cults. Probably also have this general perception of what it is to work as a banker. We think it's symmetrical that like as a 12-year-old, you probably don't really know what either of these two mean or what you actually do. So so after the characterization, we think that children are also probably generally quite moral at this age still. We think that this idea of like being super self-interested and super narcissistic actually probably comes in much later, to the point in which self-interest, you put your own self-interest above oh yeah, at the expense of others. That is when self-interest is a problem. Unclear like why all of that characterization immediately meant that this kid would just like opt in and do that. So how I'm gonna structure my speech then is like there are two roles. One is like as a 12-year-old, after all this characterization I've given you, why as a 12-year-old you would choose not to go left. And the other kind of argumentation I'm gonna give you is like, given all the information, so if I'm not a 12-year-old and I have all the knowledge, why is this choice better for this 12-year-old and for me? Cool, so if I'm in the mind space of a 12-year-old as the actor, why would I choose this? So again, I told you it's kind of symmetrical. The 12-year-old really probably doesn't fully understand what exactly you'd be doing. However, we think cults are badly portrayed by popular media. Like, when have you, like, in the motion, or in the info side, it says a prominent cult leader. Why do cults get prominence? It's probably because the last time we had a cult, it ended in mass suicide. And so we think that, like, when the perception of cults like this, and also, like, cults, like, religious cults, like the KKK, like, that shit's fucked. We think like 12-year-olds have enough access to social media, probably watch the news or like these headlines when they come up. The general perception of cults is just like, it's probably pretty bad. Don't exactly know what they do, but it seems really whack. It seems like people don't really like them much. As a 12-year-old, you just be like, yeah, like the general perception is like, this is nasty. I wouldn't opt into doing this. But then it's like, then why on this side, like why would you actually opt into like Goldman Sachs? You probably also don't know exactly what Goldman Sachs is. However, it's conventional. And the other thing the opposition, or the government fails to see is that like, oh yeah, it's this kind of idea of like, being a cult leader is not a job. It's kind of a lifestyle. This bleeds into my next point, so I'm going to leave that for later. So this is why cults probably seem really scary to this 12-year-old. They probably don't want to be in a cult. And like why the other alternative would like they would just opt into it because it's like yeah, like I know bankers, I literally see and can recognize Combank. My parents are probably work some corporate job. It's just more conventional and this seems fine because this is how like literally everyone lives. As a 12-year-old, you probably just like opt in to like the thing that wasn't really like portrayed as like kind of fucked and kind of scary that like makes news headlines. Cool. So then next thing is like why is this choice better given all available information? Literally freedom and autonomy to choose to be who you want to be. Oh my god. A cult leader is fully like a person. It's like a character. It's not like you can opt out of being a cult leader and one day to be like, yeah, like I'm gonna like my 9-to-5 job is like leading this cult and in my other hours I like do some. To be a cult leader, you probably have to engage in really wacky behavior. You really have to like and probably also believe in the ideology you spread. Even if we take like less harmful examples of like just cults just kind of being like this weird like financial like Osana group or like they just believe in like some weird like herbology thing or like medicine to replace like conventional Western medicine or whatever. That's like to believe in that's probably harmful to some extent. Probably is bad for you because probably means you engage in behavior that's like not great. And also like cults in and of themselves, it's like as a cult literally is like putting up an unconventional ideology that's probably a bit harmful and like just like we think like living that lifestyle is probably just really bad. It's probably not great that you have a shit ton of wives and you're super inbred or something like that. Or like STDs, hell yes. And the second thing on like why actually Goldman Sachs is like not too bad is literally because it's a job. You can like when you go home back to the family you built, you can choose on the weekends to go out, to do the things you like, to go volunteer, to go actually like be who you want to be. And the fact that like you would just be able to have autonomy and freedom to literally just do things. It's a job, right? It's like people work at Goldman Sachs and not everyone's killing themselves there. So surely they find some fulfillment in their life, right? And so it's just like so given that like you have all available information, why would you opt for a cult or at least like a system or a group of beliefs? That's sorry, I'll pay you.
Is that alright?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, so you keep on talking about autonomy, but people in Goldman Sachs are commonly working like 80-hour weeks and have no energy to do anything. If I'm a cult leader, I get to define how I lead that cult. I get to define the activities of that cult, and I get to use that cult to do whatever it is that I want to do.
Yeah, but what if you don't want to be in a cult? Like, it's just like, really like, you don't have to, you can quit being Goldman and, this is not really great. But I guess it's like, yeah. But I guess like, it's the idea of like, just, you have so much money when you're like working at Goldman Sachs, I imagine. You can use this money to do whatever. As a cult leader, it's unclear, like why people would just like, like what happens if, you just like decide to lead everyone to mass suicide? Or like secondly, why you have like infinite resources as a cult leader? Or like where you would spend this money, you'd probably just spend this money continuing to be a cult leader. And so ultimately at the end of my speech, what I've shown to you is why like this character is, why like if as a 12-year-old and under the mindset of a 12-year-old, you probably just like wouldn't choose to be a cult leader. And also why, given all the available information, you probably choose to be like a normal functioning person like everyone else.
Many thanks to leaders of the opposition.
Ready to go? Alright, let's talk about actor debates for a minute, because OO's case seems to be premised on the idea that a 12-year-old would not be aware that this was in their interest, even if it was. I think under that paradigm, actor debates struggle to work, right? Because every individual is presumably doing the thing that they currently believe to be in their best interest, right? So like round 2 about the CCP can't work, because Op is just like, well, if they thought it was in their best interest, they do it anyway, and therefore, since they clearly don't think it's in their best interest, it must be wrong. What we can prove to you on the Gov bench is that even if this 12-year-old doesn't currently think it's in their best interest, it is in their best interest, and that's how we can win the debate. I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to talk briefly about incentives and the unresponsiveness of OO. Next, I'm going to talk about why being a cult leader will be good engaging with the bulk of OO's material. And then I'm going to tell you why, even if you are altruistic, which is a characterization they never mechanize, but I'll engage in anyway, right? Even if you're altruistic, this is still in your interest. And then, if I get time, I might whip some of Grace's material shitting on Goldman Sachs. Just because it was completely unresponded to and that probably wins us the debate on its own. Alright, quickly on incentives, these guys are tremendously unresponsive to all of the stuff, because they're just like, as an average 12-year-old, we wouldn't be interested in these things, right? First of all, as I alluded to in my intro, it's not clear why that matters. But secondly, it's unresponsive to the stuff that Grace tells you about the context of this particular 12-year-old having worn the watch. There's a bunch of mechanisms here, like I think there's 5 in her speech, but probably the strongest one is that it just like tremendously fucks you up as an individual, right? Having this watch on you all of the time, having to constantly be aware of what is the outcome of that decision, how is that likely to affect my life, that I can never engage in a decision right now. I have to constantly be weighing up various levels of interest. I probably at that point just can no longer function as an individual. I've probably been through like so much trauma from doing that, and I probably then just, like, it's unclear to me what my interest is at that point when I have so much of an information overload about my interest, and therefore I probably just resort to basic self-interest. There's 4 more, but I won't go through them. I think that's the strongest one. And the last thing they say is, well, the media portrays cult leaders as bad. Once again, not clear that this is necessarily true, but firstly, obviously both groups are portrayed as bad, bankers and cult leaders, but bankers have a significantly bigger presence in the popular culture than bankers do, and at that extent, even if they're seen as less bad, they're probably still seen, like the net impact of badness that you get through media is still probably worse for bankers. Secondly, it's not clear to me that like cult leaders or people abusing power are seen as bad, right? Like you have a lot of anti-heroes and people who rise to power in current media. Like Far Cry literally has a cult leader and portrays the kind of power and fun that you can have as a cult leader, right? It's not clear to me at all that this is important, given that OO doesn't provide any reasons beyond just like an average 12-year-old. But I think at that point, it's pretty clear that it is in your interests to want your own self-interest. I'll take closing if you got anything.
Maybe in a minute.
Okay. Actually, I'll take opening, because I want to take one now. I can come back in a minute if you like.
Yes.
Alright, I might come back to closing then. Alright. So the bulk of OO's material is on why being a cult leader is likely to be particularly bad. The first claim is no autonomy. First of all, be comparative. There's little autonomy working for Goldman Sachs anyway. The big mechanism they give here for a lack of autonomy is that you don't have enough time, noting that Goldman Sachs bankers commonly work like 80-hour work weeks. But if I'm a cult leader, it's not clear to me that I have to have a work week. I probably just do what I want. And the next thing is they're like, yeah, but what if you don't want to be a cult leader? You can quit it, right? Obviously, you can probably leave on either side, right? But the question is, so long as we are in our jobs, at what level do we have more autonomy over how our jobs is? Is it as the middle management cog in this machine, or is it as the leader of the cult, the person who is literally defining what it is that cult does? The next thing they say is, well, you have to play the character of leading the cult. It's unclear to me that character is particularly restrictive, right? Like to the point that like God or whoever like Satan or the cult of whatever grass people I am are like speaking through me about what people ought do, then at that point I could probably just say that Mr. Grassman says that I should be spending 6 hours a day playing video games, and I probably have that level of autonomy. The next thing they say is, well, you might not want these wives, then don't have the wives. Like that was an example that Grace gives you, which is you can have have whatever you want, right? There is literally like no restriction, financial, legal, in terms of getting other people to go along with you. There is no restriction on what you're able to have. They respond to the example, but never to the analysis that Grace gives there. The next thing is they say, well, you have resources as a banker to do things. Once again, be comparative. You probably have a lot of money as this cult leader, but the thing that Goldman Sachs can never give you is the non-financial resources that you have as a cult leader. Things like people will just do what you say. Like maybe you are really into versions of chess where people kill each other when they take the pieces. Doesn't matter how much money Goldman Sachs pays me, I can't do that. As a cult leader, I have a lot of non-economic resources, like people will just do what I say.
Surely, I mean, is that clear benefit that as a divine leader you can't be questioning your ultimate power? Surely, though, that means you're consumed by paranoia that your divine power is going to be taken. And that has terrible ramifications on your mental health and everything like that.
My divine... Okay, Grassman isn't real. Grassman is a construct that I'm using in order to control people. I'm not worried that Grassman is going to abandon me and like, decide that someone in my cult is instead the one they want. Alright, why, even if you're altruistic, is it true that you still want to be part of this, noting this is an unproven characterization? Alright, first of all, Grace proves to you very, very clearly that the cult is likely to exist anyway. At that point, you can run it far, far better if you are altruistic. That's things like you can encourage freedom within that cult. That's things like you don't have to brutally oppress your people, right? And at that point, you're taking a cult that would have existed anyway, and you are then running it better. Therefore, if you are altruistic, you are reducing the net harm of that cult very, very clearly. The next claim is like, well, how do you feel, right? Because you feel bad as the leader of the cult. They bring this into POI. Grace's response here is crushing, which is to say, yes, maybe bankers and cult leaders are both seen as bad, but the cult leader just like surrounds themselves with sycophants who say that there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. To the extent that you are concerned that both institutions are bad and you have no power over either in this world, I think it's first of all worth noting that if I am super altruistic, like Goldman Sachs probably does net more harm than that cult anyway, so to the extent I have zero control, even in their best case, right? Goldman Sachs is just like fucking over the developing world and engaging in like carnivorous capitalistic practices. My cult is like giving people some sense of meaning. And yeah, I might be oppressing them, but they think they're going to heaven at the end, right? Yeah, maybe I'm doing bad things, but to the extent they get to be happy because they feel like doing those bad things is leading them to some outcome, I'm probably a lot less harmful. At that point, even if you're altruistic, it's still in your incentive. Grace proves to absolutely no response from our earth. It is way better to be a cult leader than a Goldman Sachs banker, and that's why we win.
I want to start with some key characterizations. I think that talking about the impact that this watch has on this young person is not the only thing that is influencing who they are and what influences their decisions. I think that things like the fact that lots of kids on TikTok watch like really viral videos of people being like, I escaped a cult and these are all of the awful things that happened to me inside of it, and the fact that kids are so obsessed with morals. Like when we set kids debating topics, they're just like, well, this is just good because we should do it. Kids are so obsessed with just kind of doing the nice, right thing and being nice people. And I think that like what actually, like the kind of jadedness that they're talking about comes once you go to university and do a finance major, right? Like, that sort of jadedness and like not caring about how you impact the world doesn't come until much later in life. I don't think wearing this watch means that you become as self-interested as they say. But I think that the main reason for this is just unlikely that there are that many like super intense moments like this one, right? Because it's just very uncommon in your life that turning right or left will have this like huge impact on your life. I think it's more just things like telling you that flavour of ice cream is going to be tastier than that one, so you should choose this one. It's going to be like way more normal, just like sort of helpful stuff from this watch. And it's probably what they were designed for. I don't know why people would like design a watch to traumatise people that thoroughly. I think that this is a pretty unusual situation, so you're not as traumatised as they say they are.
So I think what's really important to remember here then is that kids care a lot about being a good person. They feel like when they're 12, they can sort of do anything they want with their life and that they can and make a difference in the world. So I think that there are 4 key things that we care about. First is our relationships, which are incredibly important to children. Second is about freedom and fulfillment. And third is about having fun. So firstly, on our relationships, which is something I think has been completely ignored so far from the government bench. When you become a cult leader, you are completely cut off from the outside world. As a 12-year-old, what are the most important things to you? It is probably your relationships with your parents, your relationships with your siblings and other immediate family, and your relationships with your friends. You probably know from watching the TikToks and like YouTube videos and popular culture that talks about the worst types of cults, right? That those sorts of cults are extremely isolationist. You get disowned by your parents, your friends think you're absolutely nuts, and I think as a 12-year-old that would be fucking terrifying, right? Like, to think that you would lose all of those critical relationships, and that the people who you love the most, who mean the most to you in your entire life, are going to think you're an idiot, are going to think that you're exploiting people and being a terrible person. I think that would be devastating and something that a 12-year-old would be hugely terrified about. Kids hate being thought of as weird by their friends at school. They want to do everything to be normal. I think that taking the normal path, even if it is a boring path, would be highly appealing to a 12-year-old who just wants to blend in with their friends and just wants to maintain those things that they really love and really care about. Sure, Goldman Sachs isn't the most exciting thing ever, but at least you don't have to sacrifice literally the things you love the most in life, your family and your friends. Secondly then, on freedom and fulfillment, which they talk a lot about as sort of being important for making your mark on the world and that sort of thing. I think that, firstly, in terms of having freedom if you're in Goldman Sachs, if you always know that you're always going to be mid-tier, because that's what the watch mandates, I don't see the reason why you would feel immense pressure to be working the 80-hour work weeks that other people feel like they have because they want to progress to be like CEOs and really high-level executives. I think that when you know that you're destined to always be mid-tier, you don't feel the pressure to be working really, really hard, and that does give you the time and freedom to do other things in your life that I think are really valuable. And I think that as Winny explains to you, that kind of freedom is something that you just necessarily cannot have in a cult, because that is your entire life. There is no being a prominent cult leader and then doing social soccer on the weekends, right? You can't have both. If you're a cult leader, that is your entire life. If you work at Goldman Sachs, at least you have some choice to have a little bit of diversity in your life. I think that also, it's just incredibly unlikely in the long run that exploiting a bunch of people who probably have mental illness and trauma and a lack of direction in their life is actually going to be genuinely fulfilling. Because I think that them fawning over you has limits into how much it actually bolsters your ego. I think probably slowly it would eat away at you inside, and even though you try to ignore it and try to surround yourselves with your wives or all the people who are admiring you, you would know that in the end you are exploiting the attention and time of these people who really just need some therapy. And I think that means that that need for fulfillment is never really achieved because you know that it is exploitative. So I think that actually you're able to find that fulfillment better on our side when you have time to do things like volunteer at Lifeline after your job. I'll take you in just a second. After your job, when you're able to raise money for affordable therapy and mental health services. I'll take closing.
Surely if you become a jaded investment banker for the rest of your life, that'll have severe consequences for your mental health.
I don't think that you have to be a jaded investment banker. I think that you are able to work at Goldman Sachs and still have parts of your life that are incredibly fulfilling. That looked like still having a relationship with your family and friends. That looked like being able to do things that actually make you feel fulfilled, like volunteering and making a difference in your community, and even just raising a beautiful family that can also do amazing work in the community. I think that was far more likely to be fulfilling, and you did not have to be jaded. So I thought that you were still able to get that fulfillment and make your mark on the world. It was and like being controversial and vaguely famous only tangibly impacted a very small number of people, probably in a negative way. You were able to make your mark much better when you're able to contribute even just to your local, like very immediate community in a genuinely positive way, rather than holding people back from accessing therapy. And finally, is being a cult leader actually fun? I don't think that's true at all. I think it will be extremely stressful. You'll be worried about like going to jail for abuse or scamming, even if you didn't actually intend, because a lot of cults just end up being like that by accident. And yeah, you'll just be constantly paranoid. Yeah.
The problem with the opening half of this debate is that it is incredibly narrow, because realistically, this was not just the way up of an end goal. This was the way up of an entirely different life, and with that, totally different personhood. You were not just choosing between like, oh, one day I will wake up and like run a cult, or one day I will wake up and work for Goldman Sachs. You were trading up the entire rest of your life, the decisions that you had to make every single day, and the thing that you had to live with knowing would eventually be your fate. We think that that weighs on you in a way that is incredibly profound and is missed by the opening half of this debate. And also, we would add that given that 12 is an incredibly formative age, as OO tells you, given you are on the precipice of adulthood, you were uniquely placed to consider your life holistically and to consider what the rest of your life would be like, not just like one day when you wake up and you're 42 and you work at Goldman Sachs. In extension, I'm gonna tell you why the time up to the time that you like work at Goldman Sachs or work at a cult is like uniquely terrible if you work at Goldman Sachs. And if I have time at the end, I'll talk about why OO stuff about relationships doesn't stand. Spoiler alert, probably you could still have relationships in a cult, given that it was likely to be one big polyamorous family. You would probably bring your family along with you. Anyway, so in extension, why is the time up to the time that you become a Goldman Sachs analyst uniquely shit? And why does that mean that you would not make that decision? You know, in this debate, obviously, the greatest impact is not the moment that you are a middle-aged person with your future. Obviously, the greatest impact is the lead up to that and the experiences that you have along the way. Purely numerically, you live more years of your life in the lead up to the end goal, but also because those were years that were particularly formative and you probably thought more about at 12. So, what do you have to do in your life if you choose to turn right and you choose to become a stupid Goldman Sachs analyst? The thing that I would note here is that the hyper-specificity of that end goal makes it just necessarily bad. OG tells you a lot of this, but the thing that they miss the thing that is important here is that the life of a cult leader could be incredibly broad. You could choose what it would be like. That wasn't just true of the time that you're in the cult, it was true of the time before that. But the hyper specificity of the route that you have to take in life to become a Goldman Sachs analyst, and would certainly take if you turned right, meant that it was really bad. So, 3 reasons why it's shit. Your whole life is shit if you want to work in finance. First of all, you had to do boring shit like a business degree. You had to major in finance, and just do things that were objectively unenjoyable, like fucking take business studies for year 12. Second of all, you had to be incredibly focused, and given it is true that we know that it is true that you end up in this position, you probably have to spend your entire life being focused on money and being focused on this weird finance bro thing of a growth mindset in a way that makes you unhappy for the duration of your life and not just the time that you work at Goldman Sachs. But thirdly and crucially, you had to continue to justify this to yourself, and you had to continue to live with the knowledge that the rest of your life would be narrow and specific and boring, and all you would be doing as a mid-tier fucking analyst, not even a good one, would be crunching numbers and being average. We think that continually justifying that to yourself and, in formative years, when you're 16, 17, 18, having the knowledge that is what your life would be like, weighed on you in a way that made the rest of your life painful in a way that it would never be if you chose to be a cult leader. So, on the comparative, why is a cult leader life fucking based, and why would that be way better, not just at the time? 4 reasons why this is true. First of all, your life would be far less strict. It would not be one of academic rigor. Given, as opening tells you, that the life of a cult leader can literally be whatever you want it to be, but also given that like you don't need formal qualifications to be a cult leader, there's no like one path to success, you can do it however you wanted, your life would have less of this academic rigor that makes people incredibly unhappy. There would be less pressure on you to meet particular deadlines, and you know, your life would literally just be less boring. Also, the idea of being in a cult, comparatively, is so liberating when everyone around you is like, oh, you know, like, gotta go grind so I can get a boring job. And you can literally live the rest of your life knowing that you one day are gonna be a cult leader. Secondly, we thought that it would let you be open-minded, politically and otherwise, in a way that was probably quite enjoyable, instead of having to like be a young lib or join the business society. You could probably experiment with things that you actually thought were interesting and be open-minded in a way that would make you happy for the rest of your life. Thirdly, you literally just got to YOLO life. You could do whatever you wanted, and you knew that at the end, the thing that you were most passionate about, you would be the leader of a cult that supported that. Maybe if you like love playing soccer, maybe you join a fucking soccer cult. Like literally, you just got to YOLO life and be so fun all the time. Fourthly, we think the fact that you got choice about the kind of cult that you could choose meant that your life was just like broader and more fun the whole time. I wanted to tell you that like every cult ends in suicide, but given you get to choose what the cult is, probably are going to make something that's fun. Why is that life way better? 4 reasons. First of all, as I flagged earlier, 12 is a uniquely formative age where you actually self-actualize and you actually start to think about life more broadly. On the precipice of adulthood, perhaps you're about to start high school, maybe you just did. You see the fact that school is preparing you for like uni and work. You see your parents as people. Maybe you like have a summer job or like get the bus. We think that 12 is a uniquely formative age. I'll take it in 1 sec. Is a uniquely formative age where you would consider the rest of your life holistically and not just the end goal. Yeah, I'll take opening.
Okay, do you think as a 12-year-old you'd be more willing to never see your parents again in exchange for getting a polyamorous?
Well, like, you literally include your parents in the cult. You could literally have whatever cult you wanted. Maybe if you're really passionate about your family, your cult is just like your family being weird and reclusive. Anyway, the second reason why this life is way better is that, like, the second reason that you would choose this is that the fact that you are wearing the watch probably means that you, as an individual, like, uniquely care about your future and uniquely care about, like, the way that your decisions impacted your future in a way that was holistic. Thirdly, because OO wanted to tell you that, like, 12-year-olds think cults are lame, you know, compare the life of a cult leader up to that point to the comparative lameness of, like, a finance bro. Obviously, it's way cooler to, like, I don't know, just fuck around and do whatever you want for the rest of your life and know that whatever you are most passionate about is like the cult that you get to lead. Fourthly, 12-year-olds think about life broadly, but they don't think about finance in a way that means that you would think an entire life of finance would be interesting. You'd probably just think that doing cool stuff was fun. So, why is this important and why does this win us the debate? First of all, obviously the way up of your, like, what your entire life would be like versus one day, like, is the biggest impact in this debate and should win us the debate. Secondly, because, you know, OO wanted to tell you that they get more choice. You literally have way more choice up until that point. We think that this, like, is obviously the greatest impact in the debate, and this is why CG.
Okay, so I'm going to start off by saying I have younger cousins, they're about the age of 12, and I personally think there's been a little bit of mischaracterization. I know as a year 12, as a 12-year-old kid, I was obsessed with toys. I was obsessed with buying as much as I could. I wanted to live in Barbie's dream house. I wanted to have everything I could. And I think when a kid sees the word financial analyst, they're not going to think, oh, like mid-tier. They're not going to think, okay, mid-tier. They're going to think, I don't care about that. I see financial analyst. I see financial. That means money. I want money. I want to create a cool place where I can live and do stuff. I don't think they're going to necessarily, they'll be like Goldman Sachs, okay, maybe that's like a cool big company, I don't know. I actually don't think they'll care. I think as a 12-year-old, you're not really going to care about that. I know for me, I would only care about, okay, maybe I can make money, I want to get money, I want to do financial stuff. And I think also the second part to this is when you're a 12-year-old kid, you want to kind of follow your parents' career and exceed their expectations and stuff like that. I don't think your parent is a cult leader. Generally, that's not the case. And I don't really think you're going to be like, oh, I want to be a cult leader to kind of like show my parents I'm cool. No, I think you're going to be like, I want to go into financial stuff and like show that I'm smart and like cool like that. I'll take your point quickly, yeah.
If you care about money, would you prefer to work for your money, or would you prefer other people to work for your money and then give it to you so you can have time
okay,
to
yeah,
do
okay, perfect, thank you for that. So I think this is so irrelevant. Okay, like you guys are saying that like cult leaders are like, oh my my god, like, okay, we had that, like, they're misconstrued in, like, the media and stuff like that. Totally agree with this. And then you're saying, like, oh, cult leaders know they're actually kind of, like, low-key, I don't know if it's, like, being, like, sexy and cool kind of vibe, like, the villain, and, like, maybe they want to be that. And also, like, they have all this freedom. 12-year-old kids, heck, you don't know this. And as a 12-year-old kid, okay, I think what we're thinking of is teenagers. When you're a teenager, you're like, I want to rebel against society. I want to be a cult leader. I want to do my own thing. Like, that's a cool vibe. 12-year-olds don't think like that. They're probably going to completely disregard that. They see financial. They're like, money. I want to be a cool kid who has lots of money, who can do and buy what I want. And I think there's all this comparison between this type of stuff. And so I'm going to go through and find the different stuff that I found wasn't really addressed in each of the different speakers. So looking at OO, the second speaker, there was a POI that kind of came up about bad consequences for mental health. I want to quickly address this by saying, can we please compare the mental health that would happen with the cult leader to like a business, like financial analyst dude? Like a cult leader is constantly under pressure. And like, you know, like the cult leader, as we've been saying, it's their personality, it's their life or whatever. And so like, if you are working in a financial analyst, you can have fulfillment outside of life, outside of your job, as we said, and like you're not really able to do this as a cult leader. Like, sure, maybe you love the cult leader life, but I think even if you're going to characterize it as like a kid who's like has this watch and stuff like that, and you like want to like make decisions and stuff, I think then maybe we can characterize that as being a kid who's money like crazy and wants lots of money, because I think that's the most realistic thing in this instance. Okay, and then so we move on. And so then we were talking about like, there was a point that came up where like, everyone will hate you for being exploitative at Goldman Sachs, and that like, then we had a POI came up and you kind of talked about how like, if they're isolated within the cult, then you won't be able to get criticism and stuff like that. Just pointing it out, like same thing with bankers. If you're with all these bankers, like no one's like, I don't think, especially if you're a mid-tier banker, no one's gonna point you out and be like, oh, look at this mid-tier banker who like, blah, blah, I don't even know. And then your other point was like about like, accountability, and like there's no accountability with being a cult leader, and like just like this kid is a kind kid, and like as we've had, like he is gonna have good morals and he's gonna want to do cool stuff and like be a good person and doesn't want to hurt people. So I think this idea of accountability, like he will feel bad, and like I think if we do kind of look at like what it might happen and like with the media perception and stuff like that, then like if you know what a cult leader is, like as a 12-year-old kid, you're gonna think it's just weird. I think as a 12-year-old, like, you're not really ready to challenge the conceptions of society yet, because you're kind of still working out, like, what you believe, and your parents, in this day and age, are usually pretty conservative. So I think that generally, like, if I do a big generalization, I think that, like, they're not going to want to go and do that cult lifestyle, and definitely won't want to hurt people as a 12-year-old kid, as we've been talking about. And then, so I think, that kind of, then we're talking about, like, the 12-year-olds, they want to be an important person. This is so true. But I think that this can happen in Goldman Sachs. Because like even if they don't know what Goldman Sachs is, they'll know like roughly maybe it's a big company. And a financial analyst, like they can actually have a powerful impact and stuff like that. And like I think if we think about it, like I had this cool idea of like financial analysts, like you have these old retirement people who like are like, oh, where do we put like our investment money and stuff like that. I think that this little kid could actually potentially do a lot better within Goldman Sachs, where these old people are like, oh, where should we put this money? He helps and he's like, you put it here. Where under a cult leader, the cult leader will be like, yeah, like I'll take that, thank you. I don't think that's what we want for our cute little, like my grandparents, like if they had someone ring up and be like, hi, good Jesus, we've come to earth. I think they'd honestly like be like, oh my gosh, we'll give you our money. I don't want that. Like I'm sorry, I don't know if you guys want that, but like I think especially as a little kid, you don't want that at all. You want to help support, you know, those people around you and stuff like that. And so, you know, like, okay. So like we have this idea of like maybe this kid's self-obsessed, maybe he'll demonstrate, and so like I think yeah, maybe sure, but like in the world of like what we've created over here with the cult leader and stuff like that, he's gonna be paranoid because he's gonna be like, sure, I think there was a POI that we addressed, but like it didn't really get addressed. Like it was kind of like, oh well, you know, grass person, doesn't matter. But really like I think if I was a cult leader, I'd personally be like, oh my god, I'm a cult leader. Like pretend I'm a cult leader, like let's keep the mentality, or you're a psychopath, and like I mean like either way, it's not that great. Yeah, sure, I'll take it.
If you're arguing bankers are so insulated that they won't cop this criticism, doesn't that contradict earlier bench material that you weren't that insulated because you could have a significantly large life outside of the bank?
Okay, well that's kind of like, okay, when you think bankers, right, they like my dad is like kind of looking into that kind of vibe area, and he's like he goes to work and like he's insulated in that, like people don't know like my dad and are like, oh yes, he does banking stuff, but when he goes outside, he has his party time, he like does what he wants. These are two different ideas. I'm going to address closing government before I run out of time. So you're kind of talking about how these life choices are going to be changed and stuff like that. I think this is actually like, if he realizes this, he's going to be like, I love school. Like, I'm sorry, as a 12-year-old kid, you're generally like kind of vibing it. You've got all your friends. You're not learning hard material. He's probably going to be like, oh my gosh, go to university, learn more things, make more friends. Like, that's a vibe. A cult leader, you have to be like in a shit place. You have to fucking build yourself up. And this isn't focused on. It's like looking at like Goldman Sachs and like, oh my god, that's going to be a shit place and whatever. But like, the fact is, as a cult leader, and like also the fact that he's going to be a prominent one, he has to build himself up to that and like go through so much shit. Like, first of all, you have to start with nothing. Second, you have to learn how to manipulate people. Like, who the heck wants to do that? Third of all, you have to deal, okay, can we realize, as a cult leader, you're dealing with the craziest people out there who actually want to join a cult. So like, it's probably not a good environment, even if you're going to compare it to Goldman Sachs. And then you just have this like, you're excited, like as a little kid, you'd be excited for adult life, and like, when you're making the decision, you'd be like, oh, I want to get a job, I want to go to university, I don't want to be a cult leader. And so those reasons, I'm happy to propose.
Many thanks to the Member of Opposition first.
Good. If I knew from age 12 that I was going to become an unimportant investment banker shit kicker, then I'd be so profoundly upset. It would probably sound like the worst life I could possibly live. As it happened, that was the biggest impact in the debate, and that's exclusively what CG are able to give you. Standard whip speech, I'm going to go through the three teams and explain why we beat all of them. Let's start with opening opposition. They make three claims on their path to victory. The first is to say 12-year-olds are naturally picking more familiar things because there's consequences of their choices. Secondly, investment banks are good actually. And thirdly, cults are shit and have severe consequences. Let's address those in turn. The first claim, consequences of your choices at age 12. So, we address and we tell you that being 12 is quite a seminal age. You have some level of agency and some level of sentience. So, you have to live with the consequences of your life, like, for the rest of it, basically. You have to address a totally different personhood when you make this choice. So let's talk about those two worlds. In one world, you make a choice to become an investment banker for Goldman Sachs. You are confined to a pretty defined set of life choices. Yeah, you have this bracelet that allows you to make different life choices, but in order to become an investment banker analyst, you sort of have to do a few specific things. There's not much latitude that you have. You confine yourself to a very specific life, which, by the way, sounds totally soul-crushing. Like, you become at the end of this journey, you become a mid-tier financial analyst, so you have a terrible journey, a defined journey with no autonomy to a shit life. Sounds pretty shit. Compare that to our world. You know you're going to become a cult leader, but you basically know nothing else. That doesn't conscribe you to any other life choices. What it conscribes you to is the fact that you're ultimately going to become a prominent cult leader. So, cult leaders come in lots of shapes and sizes. Cults look like lots of different things. For instance, Trump could be argued to have run a political cult in America during the last election cycle. So cults come in lots of shapes and sizes. You ultimately have so much choice over what you do, and there's no particular shape of what a cult leader looks like. So at the very least, you have agency. Even if you regret both of the choices, at least for the 20 or so years before you become this cult leader or you become this person who works for Goldman Sachs, you have some level of agency and you're not conscribed to an extremely narrow view of life. So when you come to have further sentience in your life, i.e. you become 17, 18, 19, you're forced to continue to justify these choices to yourself. Obviously, it's going to be better when you have some level of agency over your life, as opposed to you'll have to continue to do business studies and then, commerce degree, then kiss ass with some people at Goldman Sachs. Obviously, that's bad. Okay, I'll take now opening.
The image a 12-year-old has in their heads of cults from I Escaped a Cult YouTube video isn't nuanced. It ends in the cult leader going to jail and everyone hating them. How will you justify to yourself that's a good vibe?
Okay, so there's two responses. Kids are meme lords. They probably pick the choice which fucks with other people. 12-year-olds, I don't know if you've ever coached a 12-year-old, they're quite obstinate people. But secondly, it actually doesn't matter. This is an active debate. Ultimately, if the choice is worth making, we win the debate. So there you go. Secondly, the cult's shit for you and other people. you have to live with this for 20 to 25 years. You can probably pick a cult that's not going to be harmful to you, or at the very least one that you're going to be able to live with for the rest of your life. Even if you ultimately regret the choice to become a cult leader, you can probably minimize the harm given you have all this agency. You can't do that if you're going to become a Goldman Sachs analyst. It's a very specific thing. We asked you to weigh up the profound mental health weight of a completely defined personhood from age 12 or some level of agency over a cult that you might run that could potentially be shit, but you have a bracelet that'll help you make a not shit cult. Obviously, then you probably have a better instance in our world. And not all cults are illegal and exploitative. Investment banks don't suck. Final point. Response 1, really? The second response is to say, this lifestyle's totally soul-crushing. Year 10 commerce, good grades, rise and grind, business, commerce degrees, suck up to people, unimportant shit picker. Force to justify this to yourself consistently. No thanks. Alright, let's deal with closing opposition. Their strategy to win is to be a little bit derivative and say, kids will just care about money. See financial in the word. So when they're not being derivative, the response to this is to say, this is also just breaking the actor debate. You make a choice, you'll ultimately come to regret, even if the choice, maybe you're able to make some arguments either way as to what the kid, might make. Obviously, if the choice is worth making, we win the debate. That much is clear. Kids are meme lords, they'll probably make a choice which is just really out of left field. A cult leader seems like a choice that's equally as plausible to a kid as is a Goldman Sachs analyst. That's probably why we've been set this topic. The second thing is to say, they make an argument about the mental health of cult leaders is particularly bad. CG uniquely bring you this analysis that you have all of this foresight and all of this time to have a choice of your life. You have so long to plan, you probably run something that's pretty fulfilling to you, that means something to you. I would run a Simone Biles cult if I were to be the kid in this instance. So, notice also here that closing opposition contradict themselves pretty clearly. They begin their case by saying this kid is good moral and would want to do good things in the world, and then say that you'll become like a sociopathic cult leader who runs a cult that is exploitative and that will be bad for your mental health. Those two claims cannot sit side by side. It literally is an inherent tension in their case. Insofar as you probably don't want to have shit mental health, you probably run a cult with the aid of the bracelet that's on you to help you make good choices. Obviously then, you're going to make good choices. Okay. Finally, they say you can still party, be comparative. Obviously, when you're a finance pro, you're having less parties than a cult leader. That made no sense. Alright, let's finally deal with our own opening. Their strategy to win is to say that Goldman Sachs sucks, and then the cult-like leader is pretty good. Each of those claims possibly are true. The problem with opening government, though, is they're extremely endpoint oriented, and their entire strategy to winning is contingent on proving both of those claims are true. We're able to win in two ways. The first is to say that all of the horrible life-crushing choices that you're forced to make along the way to becoming a Goldman Sachs analyst are probably so uniquely bad when compared to all of the agency that you have in becoming a cult leader that those benefits are ultimately going to outweigh, even if you come to regret the choice in either world. So, picking boring things is always going to be boring. Those severe mental health impacts were the biggest in the debate. The counterfactual is particularly probably fine. Given the stakeholder that we're talking about, 12-year-olds who have all of their life ahead of them, you obviously weigh our analysis of the life that you lead, the personhood that you choose as the most significant analysis in the debate. Ultimately, Speaker, in this debate, we would, in this world, as we would politically, turn left.
The entire closing government line relies upon the idea that it's an easy breeze to become a cult leader. Easy breeze to become a cult leader, whereas for some reason it's much harder to become an investment banker. The problem is, though, that many people become investment bankers. It's a well-trodden path. There's lots of people there to support you. But to become a cult leader, you literally have no qualifications, you're not employable, you have no friends, and you're going around trying to convince people in the grasshopper man. I don't see why that's comparatively an easier way to live life, and why closing government can ever claim the benefits because of that. So, natural structure, I'm going to go through first opening government, then I'm going to talk about why closing government can't win this debate, and then I'm going to go through how we beat opening opposition in this debate. So, closing government. what do they tell you? They tell you that this child is probably self-obsessed. Note that this is inconsistent with the idea that you'll be a good cult leader and that you're going to have good impacts. Because if you are self-obsessed, naturally you create cults that benefit you rather than, benefiting the environment or something like that. Yeah, Matt.
Your claim is that you don't cop shit because people don't know you're a banker. Do you support for the rest of your life, possibly another 50 years, hiding from your friends and the people you meet socially, hiding from the people in OO's football team that you're a banker, and lying to them and yourself about who you really are?
I mean, if your friends were so petty so as to hate you that you were an investment banker, you probably wouldn't be friends with them. The fact is, though, that you go around society, people knowing you're a cult leader, because you're prominent. No one knows who a random mid-tier Goldman Sachs financial analyst is. It's not written on your forehead in a minute, right? So we think that probably you're not being outed on the street as, oh, there's that Goldman Sachs. What you are having, though, is you're having a stable income that isn't reliant upon, Looney Tunes who are giving you money, right? You have a secure path and you have friends, right? We thought that was probably a better impact in this debate. Right, so what else do opening go? Oh, I'll take the point.
Would you feel deeply depressed if you had to spend the rest of your life knowing that all you would amount to was a mid-tier financial analyst?
Look, we have to be comparative here. All you amount to is a mid-tier financial analyst. Let's look at the reality of what happens to cult leaders, though. Like, no cult leader dies surviving as a cult leader. He either ends up in prison, he either ends up dead, or he either ends up bankrupt, right? Particularly when you're self-obsessed. Those things are crushing, right? We heard the example that Trump would be a cult leader. Look at the psychological effect losing an election had on Trump, right? We think that's a pretty crushing thing to happen to someone who's self-obsessed. So we would prefer to know that we're going to have a cushy job with money to spare rather than be someone who is going to probably not have any secure career at all. Right, finally I'm going to get back to opening government. Right, so they've told us that the cult is bad for self-obsessed people. I've already told you, those self-obsessed people who have become cult leaders are always going to end up badly, which is going to be particularly harmful for them. Secondly, though, they told you that you have less resource restrictions. I didn't see why this was true, right? Number one, there's this idea that suddenly, you just become a cult leader and you have all this money, right? Number one, it takes a lot of effort to convince people that the grasshopper man exists. To get them to give you all their life savings, right? That takes a lot of time. As opposed to following a well-trodden career path, what you have to do is continually campaign for people to give you their life savings. That's a very difficult thing to do. It's not something you can cushionly breeze through life, right? No. Right? Okay. So, we didn't think necessarily you had less resource restrictions. We also thought that you probably had to, if you had good resources, use them wisely. Why is this? Because you're under greater scrutiny when you're a prominent cult leader. What that means is that if you were going to use your money very badly, the media was probably going to report on that, and that means your likelihood of becoming an even bigger cult leader with a bigger cult is less, right? You probably couldn't use those financial resources in any way you saw fit. You probably had to acknowledge that you had people that you had to appease to maintain your power, right? Finally then, you can't be questioned, which means that as a self-obsessed narcissistic person, you're pleased, right? As a self-obsessed narcissistic person, you're also constantly questioning whether someone's coming for your job. We thought that was pretty straining on your mental health, right? So, finally though, pretty nuanced descriptions here, we thought that if you're a cult leader, you have to deal with imbeciles on a daily basis because they believed in the grasshopper man. I didn't believe in that, and I didn't want to have to deal with imbeciles, right? I thought that was probably a pretty poor way to live, right? So at their best case, where you have a self-obsessed person that's going to enjoy being a cult leader, you never had any of the benefits that they claim. That's why opening government cannot win this debate. Finally, further then, on closing government, they've told you then,
Your claim is that you have to do all of the work every day to get people to keep on joining and giving me money. Once I have a couple of grassman minions, why don't I get them to do that work for me?
Your grassman minions are stupid. They literally believe in the grassman. I wouldn't trust them to go out and campaign. Go out and do the work yourself, right? You have to go do that. So I don't think the minions are particularly good campaigners. Finally, okay, so closing government tells us that you would never want to become a Goldman Sachs person because the life is so difficult. Let's look at why they tell us it's so difficult, like why the life of a cult leader is so good. Number one, you're never having to focus on money, and they say that a Goldman Sachs person having to focus on money is unhappy, right? We thought if you're going to become a Goldman Sachs employee, number one, you had a pretty good education and you were university educated. That meant you were pretty employable compared to a cult leader who was going to talk to his, potential employer about grasshoppers, right? Or whatever it was, right? Even the idea that this cult might be good and fulfilling, right? We didn't think that was ever true. None of the prominent cults, which this is, a prominent cult, are ever like good, positive things. They're always controversial things that people get lured into, right? Because if it was just a good, positive thing, you wouldn't have to exploit people and coerce them and trick them, right? They just do it normally by themselves, right? So we didn't think that you were living a particularly fulfilled life. We also thought that you had to focus on money because you had no stable career path. That continued for your whole life, right? Because a cult isn't a guaranteed thing. So your concession that you are always going to be a mid-tier Goldman Sachs employee means you do have a continual guarantee. Finally then, it's less boring, you don't have deadlines. Once again, be comparative, right? You're bored because your mates are at university. You said you don't have to be on the grind. You can't relate to any of your people your age who are at university. That's probably pretty poor because it forces you to be an outsider in society, right? We didn't think that was something that a 12-year-old who wanted to fit in would ever likely opt for. Right. Finally, what do we prove in this debate? We are the only team at closing opposition that deals with opening government's analysis at their best case. That is why we come over 00, and that is why I'm proud to oppose. Woo!